Welcome to Superhero Pal. I'm your host nerd, Tom Fremgen. So how you doing today? Day been treating you well, or night been treating you well, depending on when you're listening to this? Well, what should we talk about today? I know what we should talk about today. How about manga? Manga, the newest sensation in illustrative magazines in the United States, of which sales, well, actually not sales of mangas themselves, but sales of graphic novels in general, have finally outpaced monthly floppy comic books. The day has finally come. And this leads a lot of people to get into, I haven't really seen any hardcore debates about this, but manga versus comic book, which is better and why and all that. Why do you buy manga instead of comic books? Why do you buy comic books instead of manga? Now, personally, I think it all just comes down to personal choice. I used to be a big anime and manga fan. I just bought everything I could find. At the same time, I was into comic books. I was into comic books first, and then I discovered manga and went crazy with it for a while. And for the most part, I've stopped getting into manga and anime, and on some level, I feel it's the same reason some people don't get into comic books. If I can make that distinction, manga is Japanese comic books, and comic books is American comic books. If we can just go with that distinction. So I feel it's the type of stories that are being told. On some level, I just kind of got tired of manga tropes. They exist. They're there. Just as much as an American comic book, you'll find a manga trope. Some knucklehead character sees a half-dressed girl and blood shoots out of his nose. Character falls asleep and a snot bubble shows up on his face. Obviously not every single manga has this, but it's very pervasive. The one thing that started to drive me nuts, and I don't know if it's out there anymore, but a tough guy in sunglasses, usually a bad guy, he would take off his sunglasses, drop it on the floor, and step on him to show how tough he was. And after I'd seen that about 20 times, I was like, good gravy. Are we doing this again? Mind you, this is just as bad as yet another superhero going like, oh no, I have to do something to protect my secret identity from, my friends and family finding out. And actually, that's kind of old hat. Now, all my friends and family know I'm a superhero. That seems to be the latest trend in comic books and superheroes in general. And a lot of new superheroes are just telling everybody who their secret identity is. Yeah, I'm Iron Man. Hi, everybody. If you didn't have any more reason to try and shoot at Tony Stark every day for whatever thing gets you mad at, now he's Iron Man, so even more people are shooting at him. But still, I think it just boils down to what's the type of story you like and what tropes can you find. And that will also lead you to go in with, well, what tropes do you accept and what tropes do you not accept? Obviously, since I enjoy superhero stories, I accept the trope of the secret identity. Doesn't bother me that much. But to somebody who really doesn't like superheroes too much, I'm sure the secret identity trope drives them mad. But when you talk to manga readers and try to find out what it is they seem to like more about manga than comic books, and this is to get away from what I think is really the main suit. It's like, what stories do you want? You don't like superheroes? Well, the chances are you're not going to like American comic books. Mind you, there are a lot of American comic books that aren't about superheroes. To a certain degree, a large portion of them I feel are kind of failed movie scripts on some level, or TV shows. Some of them I think are quite good, but I think a lot of them are quite boring because, it's like, okay, this is a movie that for whatever reason you haven't been able to sell, so you've turned it into a comic book, and I guess it's all right in comic book form. A lot of it is kind of boring. I feel like you got a visual medium, you should use it, and people just sitting around talking about viruses, it's not that exciting. And there's also some sci-fi, but strangely enough, a lot of it isn't space opera, which I kind of feel is like the biggest sci-fi subgenre out there. Star Wars and Star Trek are like the biggest names in sci-fi, and they're space opera. But they never seem to do that too much in comic books. Not sure why. Horror's making a comeback in comic books. So American comic books, they're not exclusively superheroes, but that's still the majority of them. DC and Marvel are still the biggest companies, and their output is pretty much like, 90% or more superheroes. So if you don't like that, you're not going to try it. Where the cool thing about manga is, pick a topic. They got it. You can read a comic book about anything. You want to read a comic book about a tax attorney? Yep, they've got one, I'm sure. The visual style in manga is very different than comic books too. Comic books kind of seem to have two main styles. They've got realistic or, pseudo-realistic, trying to draw perfect people, or just, if they're not perfect, as realistically as a real person as possible, and then like a cartoon style. There's not a heck of a lot in between. Where in manga, they don't kind of have either of those. They don't really have a cartoon style, and they don't have a realistic style. What they do is they blend those two styles together and come up with, a huge, vast array of different styles. Back in like the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, there was a prevailing style in anime and manga. The typical thin people with crazy big hair and big eyes. But that's kind of gone away now. In like the past 20 years or so, manga can look like anything. And the result of that is that their characters are more expressive. And, if you're not against that drawing style and some form of principle, it's pretty easy to see why those drawings are more interesting and engaging than a typical superhero comic book. Now, mind you, I'm not bashing superhero comic books. Remember, that's my camp for the most part. I just, I don't hate manga, and I'll read manga when I find something I like. I'm just not actively looking at it. But speaking as an artist and a reader, manga style and manga drawing is way more expressive, and it's much more easier to get involved with the characters because the characters are so expressive. It also allows them to do cartoony exaggeration. Now, sometimes I think that does go a bit too far. I love City Hunter a lot, but, when the giant mallets come out and whack them into the moon, every other scene, it's a little bit like, we're kind of losing our reality here if we go that far Looney Tunes too many times. But just like watching, old Mickey Mouse cartoons or Warner Brothers cartoons, since manga characters can do that, and they don't have to take it as far as those cartoons, but they can do it more than a character can in an American comic book. So it's just more expressive and more fun to see the wide range of expressions and reactions you can get in a manga as opposed to a comic book. Actually, compared to the comic books of the 70s and the 80s, I do feel some of that manga expression is sneaking in a little bit into American comic books. Not much, just a little bit, mainly because it's fun. And, comic books are meant to be fun. The biggest plus I think mangas have over comic books is the creators. There's really not a lot, to a certain degree, if any, never-ending stories. I mean, you could say that a little bit with certain things like Saint Seiya and like Gundam. They just go on forever. They just reinvent stories, or these are characters in the same universe, and it just kind of goes forever. Just like the X-Men or Batman. But for the most part, mangas are kind of steered by one person. There's usually a writer-artist in control, or there's, writer-artist teams. They do exist. And they basically do a story start to finish. The start to finish can be 30 issues. It can be 350 issues. They tell a complete story on some level. For the most part, I want to say that very rarely happens in American comic books. But considering smaller publishers like Image and IDW, that's becoming a little bit more prevalent, but they always do like to leave the door open to come back again. And so kind of like what they're doing now, well, that's a mini series or some form of limited series, but, we got more stories to tell. We can easily come back to this. And, if people are willing to buy it, we'll, keep pumping it out for 40 years, like any Marvel book. But that doesn't happen a lot in manga. One of the biggest examples I can think about that is Rumiko Takahashi's Yurusei Yatsura. This is a super popular manga turned into an anime that, both of them ran forever. But eventually, Rumiko Takahashi was kind of like, I'm done. I'm going to do something else with my life. I'm just done with it, And nobody else picked it up. It wasn't handed off to another writer or artist or anything like that. When Rumiko was done, the story was done. Though, of course, I have to add now a slight caveat because there is a new cartoon of Yurusei Yatsura, but it's a remake. They're basically taking Rumiko Takahashi's old scripts and moreover the old cartoon show from back in the early 80s and just doing it again. So it's like they're not even coming up with new stories, a new writer's not taking it into a different direction. They're just remaking it pretty much. And, I bring it up just to show that if there was a concept that could run forever in manga, it would be Yurusei Yatsura. But it didn't. And of course, this does not happen in American comic books. If there's a concept that can run forever, Superman, it does. And I know that's a big thing manga readers like. They don't necessarily like things to just roll over from writer to writer to artist, reboot, retcon. It gets to be too much. And as somebody as a fan of superhero comic books, I completely agree. And when it gets to be too much, I do drop out. Of course, this goes into ownership. The manga creators usually own, if not all, but a big chunk of their creations. So they're the ones in charge. I'm sure there are exceptions of this. In American comic books, for the most part, the ones that have been going on forever, they're not owned by the creators. They're owned by a publishing company. And as long as the publishing company exists, then the comic book character will still be published by whoever they decide to hire to do it. Of course, that is changing now a lot. There's a lot more creator-driven comic books where the creators own a chunk of the character. They don't always get controlling ownership, but at least, if something happens with the character, they're taken along for the ride. Lastly, the next thing I hear about comparing comic books to manga is people say the price. Mangas are cheaper. You get more in the sense that you get more bang for your buck. You're paying like $10 and you're getting that manga with tons of pages in it where comic books are just too expensive for how small they are. And, they're absolutely right. Comic books are too expensive for how small they are. But it's really not a fair comparison because the mangas that we all buy here in the United States, those are graphic novels. You can't compare a graphic novel to a floppy comic book because it's not the same thing. The original mangas were printed in weekly comic book anthologies. So if you were going to, if you were going to buy One Piece as it was published, you'd be buying it, pretty much every week. Oh, and in case you're curious, just to point it out for those who don't know, was one artist knocking out a weekly comic book? No, the Japanese comic book artist is not knocking out a weekly comic book. He has dozens of assistants. They all adhere to his style, and they all do different things. Somebody draws backgrounds, somebody inks, maybe the main guy is just doing layouts and faces. Then he does whatever he wants and whatever he can get to. But then he has an army of assistants who get paid nothing to make sure the book gets out weekly. But if you're buying all those weekly comic books, then you're pretty much paying the same price as buying a monthly comic book in the United States. So it's really not a fair comparison to say that you get more for your money with manga when comparing it to floppy, because the publisher is selling it twice, just like in America. You buy the comic book, you buy the graphic novel. So if you're going to compare manga in America to comic books, you have to really compare the graphic novels. Mind you, it's the world we live in, so even though I'm saying it's an unfair comparison, it's the comparison we got. One of the neatest aspects, I think, of manga versus comic books that nobody really talks about too much is color. Mangas are black and white. In fact, when some of the first ones were being brought over, Akira, Marvel was bringing it over for their Epic line, and they colored it. You know, the prevailing thought is American comic book buyers are not going to buy a black and white comic book. Well, I think manga has completely disproved that theory. So should American comic books go back to publishing in black and white? I remember reading independent comic books way back in the day, and they were always black and white because they didn't have the money for color. So it was always a sign of cheapness. But clearly a black and white comic book can be successful, or at least it's super successful in manga form. And as seems to be clear that as manga gets bigger and bigger in the United States, how the American publishers are going to adapt their industry, their models to that. So far, it just seems to be like, well, we'll just draw big eyes on people and have cars explode with tentacle monsters, and we'll call it Avengers manga. And as you can tell, they're not publishing Avengers manga right now, so that didn't work. I don't think a lot of manga fans are necessarily looking for manga versions of American superheroes. It's kind of like if this is a market they want to grow into, they got to embrace it whole hog. They got to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, so to speak. They probably just got to get a creator, give them control, make it a black and white comic book, don't color it, see how it goes. But since we always have such a negative opinion of the people who run comic book companies, that'll probably never happen. They want to use their IP so they don't have to pay for it, and they want to put it in color because, well, you know, that's what the buyers want. They want color. Kind of reminds me of an old story of Stan Lee and DC Comics back in the day. DC Comics was apparently trying to figure out why Marvel was outselling them. Kind of just like American publishers are trying to figure out how manga is outselling them and completely misunderstanding why. DC was looking at Marvel's comic book covers saying, hey, you know, there's a lot of red in these covers. Maybe it's because there's a lot of red in the covers. That's why people are buying Marvel comic books. So Stan Lee said, no more red in our comic books. Don't put any red in our comic books, and we'll continue to sell out DC, and they won't understand a thing. Ha! Excelsior! And then I believe the same thing happened with word balloons. DC was like, oh, it's word balloons. And then Stan said, no more word balloons. You know, he didn't do it forever, but he just did it for a time just to irk DC. But what do you think? You think mangas are superior to comic books or comics are superior to mangas? What would you like to see American comic books do to try and compete more with manga? Or do you think the two of them should just, quote unquote, stay in their lane? I don't have all the answers, but thanks for listening and watching. And if you can be so kind to like and subscribe, you know, I'll make more of these. Until then, take care of yourself, all right?